The hardest part wasn't the casket. It was the empty pew behind me. I want to tell you what happened on a Tuesday morning in October, in a small chapel outside Asheville, North Carolina. I want to tell you because for 43 years I believed I had built something that would hold. A family, a home, a name people would speak with kindness when I was gone. And in 2 hours on the morning we buried my husband, I learned that what I had built was paper, the kind that catches fire from a single match. My name doesn't matter much for what I'm about to tell you. What matters is that I am 68 years old, that I was married to a man named Holden for 43 years, and that on the morning of his funeral, the only people who came were me, the pastor, the funeral director, and a young woman from the church choir who had been paid to sing. Let me start at the beginning, because if you don't understand who Holden was, you won't understand what they took from him. Holden was a quiet man, the kind of quiet that people sometimes mistake for slowness, but it wasn't that at all. He was the slowest to anger and the slowest to praise, and when he gave you either, you knew it had been weighed. He was a high school shop teacher for 31 years before he retired. He built our kitchen table with his own hands the year we bought the house in 1987, and that table sat 8, and we filled all 8 chairs more times than I can count. Birthdays, Thanksgivings, the Sunday dinners I used to make when our kids were small, and the smell of pot roast would pull them in from the yard like a magnet. We had 2 children, a son Brom, who is 41 now, and a daughter, Cassidy, who is 38. There was a third pregnancy between them. But I lost that baby at 5 months, and Holden held me in our bedroom for 3 days while I couldn't stop crying, and he never once said the things people say. He just stayed. That was Holden. He just stayed. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in late June. By the time we knew, it was already in his liver. The oncologist was kind. He used soft words like manage and comfort. Holden looked at me across the desk in that office, and he reached for my hand, and he squeezed it once, and I knew. He was telling me without saying it that we were going to get through whatever came next the same way we had gotten through everything else, together, quietly, without complaint. We had 97 days from that diagnosis to the morning I woke up at 4:47 a.m. and reached for him, and his hand was already cold. I called the children that morning. Bram was in Charlotte. Cassidy was in Atlanta. I remember my voice sounding strange, like it was coming from somewhere outside my body. I told them. I said the words I had been practicing in my head for weeks. Your father passed early this morning, and then I waited. Bram was silent for a long beat. Then he said, Mom. Okay, I'm in the middle of something for work. Can I call you back this afternoon? I said yes, because what else do you say? Cassidy cried, or made the sounds of crying. I have learned, in these last few weeks, the difference between the two. She said, Mama, I can't believe it. I have to go. I'll call you. She did not call me back that day. She called me back 2 days later, when I had already chosen a casket alone. The funeral was set for the Tuesday following. 5 days. I gave them 5 days. I gave them everything they needed to know. I sent them the address of the chapel. I sent them the time. I told them the pastor's name and what flowers Holden had liked, and that there would be a small lunch afterward at the house, with sandwiches I had ordered from the deli on Patton Avenue because I couldn't bring myself to cook. My son told me on the Sunday before that he had a career-defining presentation that Tuesday and could not, in good conscience, miss it. He said his father would have understood. He said Holden had always told him to put his work first. That last part was a lie. Holden had never said any such thing. Holden had told that boy, more times than I could count, that work was something you did so you could come home to the people you loved. But I didn't argue. I just said, all right. And I hung up the phone. And I sat on the edge of our bed. And I looked at the closet where Holden's flannel shirts were still hanging. and I didn't cry. I think I had moved past crying by then. My daughter told me on the Monday night that there was a situation with her in-laws. She said her mother-in-law had thrown a 60th anniversary party for her father-in-law that had been planned for months, and that if she missed it, there would be consequences for years. She said, "Mama, you understand. You know how Whit's mother is. Daddy would want me to keep the peace." She said she would come the following weekend. She said she would bring the grandkids. She said she loved me. She said all of this on a phone call that lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I know because I checked later. I checked because I needed to know whether what had happened had really happened or whether I had imagined it. Holden had 2 siblings, but his brother had died in 2015, and his sister Loretta lived in Oregon and had a hip replacement scheduled for that very week. She sent flowers and called me, weeping, and I told her not to fly. I meant it. I didn't want her dragging a fresh hip across the country to sit in a pew. I told her I'd be all right. The lie came easy. There were neighbors, of course. There were people from the church. There were 2 men Holden had taught with at the high school, both retired now, both in their 70s. I had told them all the time and place. I had assumed. That was my mistake. I had assumed. That was my mistake. I had assumed. On the morning of the funeral, I dressed alone in our bedroom. I put on a navy blue dress because Holden had never liked me in black. I put on the pearl earrings he had given me on our 20th anniversary. I drove myself to the chapel because there was no one to drive me. The chapel was on a country road, set back among pine trees, and as I pulled into the parking lot at 9:42 in the morning, I saw 3 cars. The pastors, the funeral directors, the hearse. That was all. I sat in my car for a long time. I want to tell you that I prayed, but I didn't. I want to tell you that I gathered my strength, but I didn't have any to gather. What I did was I looked at my hands on the steering wheel. They were my mother's hands. I hadn't noticed that before. The same age spots, the same knuckles. And I thought, my mother died alone too. Maybe this is just what happens to women in our family. Maybe we should have known. The pastor met me at the door. He was a young man, not more than 35, and his face went through several emotions in the space of about 4 seconds when he realized I was the only one coming. He kept looking past me at the parking lot. I watched him do it 3 times. Then he stopped, and he took my hand, and he said, "Mrs. Wexley, would you like to come inside?" I said yes. The chapel held about 80 people. I had told the funeral director to set out 40 programs just to be safe. They were stacked on a small table by the door, untouched. The flowers Holden had loved, white lilies and yellow roses, were arranged on either side of the casket. There was a photograph of him on an easel near the front, taken at our daughter's wedding. He was laughing in that picture. He was laughing the way he used to laugh when our kids were small and one of them had said something accidentally funny at the dinner table. I walked to the front pew. I sat down. The pastor looked at me, and I nodded, and he began. He said all the things you say at a funeral. He said Holden had been a good man, a faithful husband, a devoted father. He said Holden had walked humbly with his God. The young woman from the choir sang, "It is well with my soul," and her voice was clear and high and beautiful. And I cried for the first time in 5 days, not because of the song, but because of the empty pews behind me and the way her voice filled them where my children should have been. The pastor read from the 23rd Psalm. He spoke for maybe 12 minutes, and then it was over. They lowered Holden's casket into the ground in the small cemetery behind the chapel, and I threw the first handful of dirt, and I drove home alone, and I unlocked the front door of the house we had bought in 1987, and I walked into the kitchen, and I sat down at the table he had built with his own hands, and I waited. I waited because I thought, surely one of them would come. No one came. The lunch I had ordered from the deli sat on the kitchen counter in its white paper boxes. 18 sandwiches, 6 containers of potato salad, 3 pies. By 6 o'clock that evening, I had not eaten any of it. I had not turned on a single light. I sat at the table in the gathering dark, and I thought about my husband, and I thought about my children, and I thought about the 43 years of meals at that table. And I thought, very calmly and very clearly, something has to change. That night, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to a woman named Verity Sloan. Verity had been my best friend since the 7th grade. She lived in Charlotte now, 3 hours away, and she had not been at the funeral because I had not told her. I had not told her because I had been too proud to admit that my own children might not come. When she answered the phone, I said, "Holden was buried this morning and no one came but me, and I need you to come." Verity said, "I'm getting in the car right now." She drove through the night. She arrived at 11:30. I let her in, and she walked into my kitchen and she saw the sandwiches and she didn't say a word. She just put her arms around me and I cried the way I had not cried in 5 days. The way I had not cried in 5 days. The way I had not cried in 15 years. And she held me until I was finished. The second call was to Holden's lawyer, a man named Cresswell Bowen, who had been our family attorney for 31 years. I left him a voicemail. I said, "Cress, I need to revise my will. Please call me first thing in the morning." The third call was to my grandson. His name is Tully. He is 14 years old. He is my daughter Cassidy's only child, and he is the only one of my grandchildren who calls me on his own without being prompted. He is awkward and tall and wears the same gray hoodie for what looks like weeks at a time. And he loves chess, and he loves his grandfather more than anyone in the world ever did, except for me. When I called him that night, his voice was small. He said, "Grandma, I'm so sorry." I said, "Tully, did you know? Did you know your grandpa's funeral was today?" There was a long silence. Then he said, "Mom said it was next weekend. She said we were going next weekend. I just looked it up online tonight, after I saw what Aunt Gibbsy posted on Facebook. Grandma, I'm so sorry. I would have come. I would have been there." He started crying. He was 14 years old and he was crying, and I sat in my dark kitchen with my best friend across from me. And I listened to my grandson cry into the phone, and I thought, there is one of them. There is still one of them. There is still one of them. I told him I knew. I told him it wasn't his fault. I told him his grandfather had loved him more than any person on this earth, and then I told him I needed him to do something for me. I needed him to come stay with me for the weekend, the very next weekend. I told him I would arrange it with his mother. I told him I needed him. He said, "I'll be there, Grandma. I promise." That was the first night. The next morning, Cresswell Bowen came to the house at 8 o'clock. He had been Holden's lawyer for 3 decades, and he had known us when our kids were small, and he had drawn up our original wills the year after we bought the house. He sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and he listened to me talk for about 40 minutes without saying a word. I told him everything. The phone calls, the excuses, the empty chapel, the 18 sandwiches still sitting on my counter. I told him about Tully, who had been told the funeral was a different day. I told him I had been thinking all night long about what Holden and I had built and about what we had been planning to leave behind, and how that plan had been made under different assumptions about who our children were. I said, "Cress, I need to know. Legally, can I change everything?" He set down his coffee. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes, you can change everything. You're the surviving spouse. The estate passes to you in its entirety. What you do with it from there is your business." I said, "Then I want to start fresh. I want a new will. I want to make sure that when I'm gone, the people who were there for me are taken care of, and the people who weren't are not." He nodded. He pulled out a yellow legal pad. He uncapped his pen, and we began. The estate was larger than most people would have guessed, looking at our modest house and our modest cars. Holden had been quietly disciplined with money for 43 years. He had inherited a small amount from his father, and he had grown it, slowly, with the patience of a man who had built things with his hands his whole life. There was the house, paid off. There was a cabin in the Blue Ridge that Holden's grandfather had built in the 1940s. There were retirement accounts and a brokerage account and a life insurance policy, all told just under $2.5 million. For 30 years, the will had been simple: half to Brom, half to Cassidy. The cabin to be shared between them. That was the will I tore up that morning, sitting at my kitchen table with Cresswell Bowen. The new will took us most of the day to draft. Verity stayed. She made us sandwiches from the deli boxes, the ones still untouched on the counter. And we ate them while we worked. By 4 in the afternoon, we had it. The new will read as follows: $200,000 to Verity Sloan, my dearest friend, in gratitude for the friendship of a lifetime. The cabin in the Blue Ridge. To my grandson, Tully Wexley Crane. To be held in trust until his 25th birthday, with the understanding that it had been his grandfather's favorite place on earth, and his grandfather had taught him to fish there. $500,000 in trust for Tully's college education and the start of his adult life. $200,000 to the Western Carolina Vocational Education Foundation in Holden's name, to fund scholarships for boys and girls who wanted to learn to work with their hands. $50,000 to the church choir, with a note specifying that it was for the young woman who had sung at the funeral with no one but a widow to hear her. The remainder of the estate, including the house, was to be held in a charitable trust, the income of which would fund a small foundation in Holden's name, providing emergency assistance to widows over the age of 60 in our county. Bram and Cassidy were left $10,000 each. There was a letter attached to the will, to be read aloud at the time it was distributed. I'll come back to the letter. I signed the new will at 4:47 in the afternoon, exactly 12 hours after the moment my husband had died. Cresswell witnessed it. Verity witnessed it. He took it back to his office to be filed. Then I called my children. I called Bram first. I told him I had updated my will and that I wanted him to know. I did not tell him the details. I just told him there had been changes. He was distracted on the phone. He said, "Mom, that's fine, whatever you need to do. Listen, I'm sorry about Tuesday. I'll come down this weekend." I said that wouldn't be necessary. He didn't notice the change in my voice. He said, "Okay, love you, gotta run." And he hung up. I called Cassidy next. She was warmer, the way she always is. The warmth that I have come to understand is a kind of performance. She said, "Mama, I felt awful all day Tuesday. Whit's mother was a nightmare at the party. I should have just come. I'm sorry. I'm bringing the kids next weekend, all right?" I said that would be fine. I did not mention the will. She did not ask. I hung up the phone. Verity was watching me from across the kitchen table. She said, "How do you feel?" I said. "I feel like I can breathe." That was the second day. The weekend Tully came. He stayed for 3 days. I picked him up at the bus station in Asheville on a Friday afternoon. He got off the bus with a backpack and a chess set, and he was taller than I remembered, and he hugged me without me having to ask. We drove home, and we ate grilled cheese sandwiches at the kitchen table his grandfather had built, and we talked about Holden until the light went out of the sky. Tully said, "Grandma, do you think he knew?" At the end, "Do you think he knew how much I loved him?" I said. "Sweetheart, your grandpa never doubted it for a minute. Not 1 minute in all the 14 years he knew you." That boy cried. He cried into a paper napkin at my kitchen table, and I held his hand across the wood, and I made a promise to myself, sitting there, that I would not let what had been done to Holden's funeral be done to this boy's understanding of family. I would build him a new one. I would build him one that held. On Saturday morning, I drove him out to the cabin. We hadn't been there since Holden's diagnosis. The road in is gravel, narrow, lined with rhododendron. The cabin sits on a small lake, and the dock is the same dock Holden's grandfather had built in 1947. Tully and I sat on that dock for about 3 hours. We didn't fish, we just sat. He asked me questions about Holden, things I didn't know he wondered about, and I answered them all. Then I told him. I told him that the cabin was his, that his grandfather had loved him and I loved him, and the cabin had been the place where his grandfather had been the happiest, and that we wanted him to have it. I told him about the trust for his education. I told him I had done all of this 2 days after the funeral, and that I had done it because of the way his grandfather had been treated, and the way I had been treated, and that I wanted him to understand that what I was giving him was not a reward for being loved, but a reward for showing up. Tully sat on that dock and looked at me with his 14-year-old face, and he said, "Grandma, I don't want it." I said, "Tully, listen," he said, "Grandma, I don't want any of it. I just want you. I want you to be okay." I have thought about that sentence every single day since. I just want you. I told him he could give it back when he turned 25, if he wanted. I told him he didn't have to decide anything now. But I told him that the cabin was his, and the trust was his, and I needed him to accept it, because his grandfather would have wanted it. He nodded. He didn't say anything else. We drove home, and we made spaghetti for dinner. And that night I heard him crying through the wall of the guest bedroom, and I went in, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I rubbed his back the way I used to rub his mother's back when she was a little girl, before any of this had happened. That was the third day. Cassidy found out about the will 11 days later. She found out because Bram found out first. He had called Cresswell's office to ask a question about some paperwork, and Cresswell, who is an old-school man and a careful one, had told him, gently, that the will had been revised and that he should speak to me about any details. Bram drove down from Charlotte that same afternoon. He arrived at my front door at 6:15 in the evening. He did not knock. He used his key. He walked into my kitchen, where I was making myself a salad, and he said, "Mom, what did you do?" I told him the truth. I told him I had revised the will, and that the new will reflected what I wanted, and that I was not going to discuss the specifics with him. He said, "Mom, you can't be serious. You're upset. You're grieving. You're not in your right mind." I set down the knife I was using to cut a tomato. I said, "Son, look at me." He looked at me. I said, "I am 68 years old. I buried your father 11 days ago. I sat in an empty chapel because you were giving a presentation and your sister was attending her mother-in-law's anniversary party. I came home to a house that had no one in it. I made decisions that night, and I have made more decisions since, and every single one of them has been made with a clear head and a settled heart. Do not stand in my kitchen and tell me I am not in my right mind. The only thing that has changed about my mind is that it has finally cleared." He didn't have an answer for that. He stood there in his good coat, with his car keys still in his hand, and I could see him trying to find the angle, trying to find the lever, trying to find the thing he could say that would make me reverse what I had done. He didn't find it. He left at 6:38. Cassidy called me from her car 20 minutes later, sobbing. I let it go to voicemail. I let the next 3 calls go to voicemail too. The next morning, I called her back. She was incoherent. She was furious. She accused me of being cruel, of being vindictive, of punishing her for one mistake, of letting Tully manipulate me, of letting Verity manipulate me. She said her father would be ashamed of me. She said her father would be ashamed of me. She said, "Mama, this isn't who you are." I let her say everything she had to say. I waited until she was done. Then I said very quietly, "Cassidy, your father would be ashamed of you. He would be ashamed of you for missing his funeral. He would be ashamed of you for telling Tully it was a different day so that the only grandchild who loved him couldn't be there. He would be ashamed of you, my daughter, for what you have shown me about who you are. And I am too. I am ashamed for you because you don't have the decency to be ashamed for yourself." She hung up. She did not call me back for 14 weeks. In those 14 weeks, several things happened. Bram had a financial setback at work and called me asking for a loan. I declined. He stopped speaking to me. Cassidy's marriage went through what she eventually described as a rough patch, and she did not tell me the details, but I gathered from Tully that her husband had been less impressed by her absence at his father-in-law's funeral than she had anticipated. Tully came to stay with me almost every other weekend. We started a routine. Saturday mornings, the cabin. Saturday nights, spaghetti. Sunday mornings, church, then home, then he'd take the bus back to Atlanta. He was getting taller. He was getting less awkward. He was learning to laugh again. In month 4, Cassidy called me. She was crying. She said, "Mama, I want to come see you." I said, "All right." She came alone. She left the kids with Wit. She sat at my kitchen table in the chair where her father used to sit, and she cried for a long time. And then she said, "Mama, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I think about Daddy every day. I think about that morning. I don't know why I did what I did. I don't know why I lied to Tully. I don't know why I picked a stupid party over my own father. Mama, I don't recognize myself." I let her cry. I let her talk. I poured her a cup of coffee, and I said the thing I had been thinking for 4 months. I said, "Cassidy, I forgive you. I'm your mother, and I'll always love you, and I forgive you. But I will not change the will. The will stands. What you do with the rest of your life, with your husband, with your children, with your brother, with me, is up to you. But you cannot undo what was done. You can only do better from here." She cried harder. But she nodded, and she stayed for dinner. It has been 8 months now since Holden died. Cassidy and I are slowly rebuilding something. It is smaller than what we had. It is more honest. It is, I think, more real. Bram and I have not spoken since the night he came to my kitchen. I send him cards on his birthday. He does not reply. I have made peace with the possibility that he may never reply. Tully is 15 now. He spent 2 weeks with me at the cabin in June. We caught 14 fish, and we read books on the dock, and one evening he asked me what his grandfather's voice had sounded like because he was forgetting, and I sat with him, and I described it for him, the gravel of it, the slow way it moved, the way it would catch when he was trying not to cry. I told him, "Tully, your grandfather's voice was the sound of a man who stayed. That's what you remember. He stayed. The cabin will be his, and the trust will be his. And the foundation in Holden's name has already given out its first 3 grants this spring to widows in our county who needed help paying the heating bill or the prescription bill or the funeral bill of the husband who left them." Sometimes I sit on the back porch in the evening, alone, and I think about that morning in the chapel. I think about the empty pews. I think about how I drove home by myself, and how the sandwiches sat in white boxes, and how the light went out of the kitchen while I waited for someone who wasn't coming. And I think that was the morning I learned what I was made of. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't revenge. It was something quieter than either of those things. It was a woman, 68 years old, sitting at the table her husband had built, deciding that the love she had to give for the rest of her life was going to go to the people who had earned it. That's all. That's the whole story. If you are watching this, and you have given everything to people who could not be bothered to give you 2 hours on the worst morning of your life, I want you to know something. You are not crazy. You are not cruel. You are not bitter for noticing. You are awake, and it is never ever too late to decide what you want to do with the rest of your one good life. I have been thinking, in these quiet months since Holden was buried, about the strange and patient way that consequences arrive in a life. When my son Bram told me that Tuesday morning that his career came first, he was not making one decision. He was making the last in a long string of decisions, stretching back 20 years, that had already shaped the man he had become. The empty pew was not a moment. It was a harvest. And when my daughter Cassidy lied to her own son about the date of his grandfather's funeral so that her absence would not be witnessed by the one person in our family who would have judged her honestly, she was not protecting her marriage. She was teaching her boy a lesson about who she was. The strange mercy of that morning is that he learned the lesson anyway and chose differently. I have come to believe that character is not built in the loud moments. It is built in the small, unwatched ones. The phone call you do or do not return. The 2 hours you do or do not give. The truth you do or do not tell a 14-year-old boy who is asking when his grandfather will be put in the ground. Holden gave 43 years of small, unwatched moments to our children, and he believed, as I believed, that those moments were being stored up somewhere, that they would matter when the time came. We were wrong about where they were being stored. They were being stored in us, not in them. That is the part I want you to hear. The love we gave was not wasted. It made us who we are. It made me capable, on the worst night of my life, of sitting at a kitchen table and making 3 phone calls that changed everything. It gave me the steadiness to revise a will at 68 years old without my hand shaking. The love we poured into our marriage and our home and our children did not return to us through them, but it did return to us. It came back as backbone. I have stopped believing that family is a debt anyone owes you. It is not. Family is a daily choice that some people make and some people don't, and you do not get to know which until something hard happens. What I would say to anyone listening is this: pay attention. Pay attention to who calls. Pay attention to who comes. Pay attention to the 14-year-old boy in the back of the room who is quietly loving you while everyone louder is performing. He is the one. He has always been the one. You have one good life. You owie you asti. You owe yourself the courage to look at what is, not at what you wish were true. And you owe the people who showed up for you, however few they are, the dignity of being seen and chosen back. That is the only inheritance worth leaving.